Okay, good morning. Thank you for being here to this panel that called Regulatory Challenges in the Changing Space Landscape. We're gonna listen to Ugo Pagaglio from the University of Turin, Italy. Is that okay? Do you want to start or? Yeah?
Yes,
Okay,
of course. And
great. Thank you.
how many minutes do you have?
You have around 30 minutes, so we leave 10 minutes for questions at the end.
Of course.
Great, thank you.
And so let me try if I can share. Okay, here we are. And well, it's a pleasure to be here. Actually, I'm in California, not in Italy, these weeks. And straight to the point. My focus is going to be on the regulatory challenges in today's space law. And I would like to start with a thought experiment, namely, and okay, and namely the fact that technology plays a crucial role here. And in particular, I will focus on the challenges brought forth by AI systems, smart robots, and other emerging technologies. Uh, my claim here is that such challenges add to the complexity and drawbacks of today's space law. In other words, for the sake of the argument, we can imagine a world in which we have no legal issues with current space activities and missions, and still we should add a further layer of complexity, namely the regulation, and in particular my focus will be on the need for new standards for the use of AI systems, robotics, and other technologies displayed in outer space. Of course, this is a thought experiment because, to say the least, space law today has a lot of problems. And we should start with the international legal framework, namely the, let's call them the agreements of the Golden Age, that is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, then the 1972 Liability Convention, down to the 1976 Registration Convention. And, well, I would dare to say that most scholars agree that these agreements, treaties, conventions, are falling increasingly short in dealing with the challenges of today's space law. For a number of reasons, let's sum up these reasons according to 2 points. On the one hand, those agreements couldn't foresee the further developments of technology. What's happening today would have been considered as a science fiction only 20, 30 years ago. And since we are referring to international agreements from the 1960s and 70s, well, can imagine that what should be regulated today was not under the lens of those international agreements. For example, how to deal with increasingly autonomous intelligence systems displaced in outer space. On the other hand, of course, we have a political problem with those international legal agreements. And again, I would dare to say that most scholars would agree that the crisis of the international framework started with the Moon Agreement from 1979 and the fact that very few countries signed that international agreement. So what are the open issues of the field? Well, there is a long list here. Let's start with matters of appropriability. Actually, according to the Outer Space Treaty from the late 1960s, in Article 2, states, national states, agreed that space resources wouldn't be never under the sovereign powers of states, and national appropriability of space resources should be prohibited. But actually, this doesn't mean that private appropriability of such space resources is prohibited as well. And actually, we have several national legislations from the US to Luxembourg to the Japan and the like that actually consider such private appropriability of space resources as legitimate. The same problems apply to the potential occupation of space places, especially considering next generation celestial colonies. Or number 3 of my list, matters of safety zones for the confliction. Actually, we have those safety zones in relation to the International Space Station, but after the Artemis Accords from 2019, namely a series of bilateral agreements between the US and other sovereign states, well, scholars wonder about several issues brought forth by such safety zones on, for example, the moon. But we have also environmental concerns, not only referring to the celestial environment, but the fact that both the space environment and the Earth environment are should progressively be considered as a whole single system. Not to talk about problems of overpopulated orbits. In this case, number 4 or 5 of my list, of course, are strictly related. Plus cosmic debris, space traffic management. In a nutshell, we have several crucial, critical problems that still have to be properly tackled at the international level. And to add a further layer of complexity, when we are referring to the troubles of the law with space activities, we don't have to pay attention only to traditional space law, because several other legal fields are relevant in this case. For example, we have all cybersecurity regulations. We have problems of data privacy. We have consumer law regulations. Again, we have environmental law regulations, and all the regulations related to artificial intelligence and robotics. Of course, there are some differences between jurisdictions and legal systems. And so, in many cases, how to put it, environmental law is not particularly relevant when dealing with matters of space law. But, for example, since I've been working especially with European regulations, in Europe, we have to take and we have to consider all these further set of legal regulations, in particular considering the last year European Union regulation from 2023, a few months ago. Attention should be drawn to regulations concerning cybersecurity and environmental law, as much as the new Artificial Intelligence Act in Europe, which on the one hand we expect will be valid law next year, and on the other hand will likely concern the use of AI systems and robotics displayed in outer space. So back to my thought experiment. As you can see, it's really an ideal world that in which we may assume that we have no legal issues concerning the current space activities and missions, and the several problems concerning cybersecurity, environmental law, consumer protection, and the like. But here's the point. In addition to norms, values, or principles that can be adopted as the basis of a legal decision, focus should be on standards, and in particular as regards standards for next generation space missions and the use of increasingly autonomous intelligence systems. Here I consider standards as thresholds of evaluation that should allow policymakers and courts to assess benefits and risks of technology. I'm drawing on a paper I published with Eleonora Bassi and Massimo Durante some months ago in Philosophy and Technology. And the claim in this paper is that there is a fourfold way in which we can examine how the uniqueness of artificial intelligence and that of outer space can impact standards of the law. When I'm referring to the uniqueness of outer space, well, it's always important to stress that outer space poses some unique problems. And in addition, we should stress the fact that AI systems raise some unique normative issues as well, so due to the degree of uncertainty and unpredictability related to their behavior. In fact, when I'm referring to AI systems and robots, or according to the IEEE definition, I'm referring to autonomous intelligent systems. Well, we are not only referring to a sort of a tool or a means used by humans in order to attain whatever goal. Actually, when we are dealing with AI systems and robots, we are dealing with agents, autonomous agents, and so what's even more important is the fact that those agents can take decisions of their own, and this is particularly relevant in outer space. And well, this fourfold way in which AI systems displaced in outer space may impact standards of the law may regard four different kinds of standards. A first class of standards concerns a new generation of sub-general standards of space law. Here we are back to what's unique dealing with outer space missions, and for example, consider the uniqueness of moon orbits or of the Mars environment and the like. And well, here is pretty clear that we may imagine a world in which we don't have legal issues of probability of space resources, of occupation of lunar spaces and the like, and still work is needed as regards the development of this new generation of standards of space law. Same applies for the use of AI systems and robots in outer space. My claim is here that first, dealing with deep space missions, well, the interaction between human and robots, human and AI systems will be essential. Even in current standard space missions, both NASA and the European Space Agency are using and further developing those systems. In particular, I'm thinking about humanoid robots will be that will be really important for these activities. And moreover, when we think about the next generation of autonomous spacecrafts and the very possibility that the first colonies on the moon or Mars will be populated mostly or only by those AI systems and robots. And so here my assumption is that in some cases, we may suspect that we'll need stricter standards for the use of those AI systems. For example, consider the next generation of space tourists or mass space explorers. And actually, the current regulations fall short in dealing with this new generation of humans in space. Even the very notion of astronaut is changing, and the more everyday people will be in space, the more is likely that certain standards of conduct for such AI systems and for human-robot interaction shall be stricter than current standards. But on the other hand, we may also imagine that in certain cases, such standards could be more flexible. Here I'm thinking about human-robot interaction and matters of privacy and confidentiality concerning this very interaction. And especially considering deep space missions, well, a number of reasons regarding social acceptability, the role that personal choices play when dealing with matters of privacy and the like may suggest that we're going to have, or we shall have, more flexible standards concerning human-robot interaction in outer space as regards matters of privacy. Some scholars have even proposed, talking about more flexible standards, more challenges scenarios of, for example, having sex with robots in a deep space mission. This is really controversial. I think that the very example of privacy and confidentiality concerning the interaction between a human and her artificial companion, it's enough. But since in some cases we may imagine stricter standards for AI in outer space, in some other cases more flexible standards, how to take sides in more controversial cases. And my suggestion here is that we should adopt a sort of a principle of equality between human standards and the robotic standards in case of doubt. For example, just to illustrate this principle of equality, consider that in next generation missions, it's not a real futuristic scenario thinking about people traveling from the moon to Mars or vice versa. Well, consider a human with health problems. And we already have a number of AI systems and smart robots here down on Earth that are very effective in medicine and, generally speaking, in the health sector. And whereas some scholars claim that we can use robots or AI systems only if they guarantee stricter standards than humans. An example, some scholars claim that we can adopt a new generation of self-driving cars, and generally speaking of autonomous vehicles, only when their safety and security standards are stricter than human standards. Well, I reckon that we have to prevent such supererogatory solutions in space activities. Namely, a robot doctor shouldn't be better than the best human doctor here down on Earth, especially when you find yourself with health issues between Mars and the Moon. So, summing up, this kind of research on the realignment of terrestrial standards is its very beginning. It's still terra incognita or in its infancy. And I think that the breathtaking advancements of technology, as well as the increasing dependence of Earth from space-based services, for example, the crucial use of satellites, will make this problem urgent over the next few years. So we have several tricky legal issues concerning today's space activities and missions. But on top of that, we shall consider how the increasing use of AI systems and robots displays in outer space will add a further layer of complexity in our field. And open to your questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Pagalo, for your presentation. If that's fine with you, we can leave the questions at the end for both of you.
Sure.
Now we pass the floor to Charles Mudd from Mudd Law. Go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
There you go. You know, you'd think after so many years, those kind of things just wouldn't happen. but muting continues to be an issue. So thank you so much. I'm happy to speak and particularly follow the presentation that we had from Ugo about the future of AI in particular in space. What I'd like to do is kind of follow up on that and talk more about the future of US regulatory regime particularly. Let's say at the outset, and I guess the question for Ugo down the line is, I think we'd both be agreeing, but when we get to the questions, I completely advocate being a part of the international community. And from the United States perspective, I think all spacefaring countries need to be a part of that international community, working together on what the future of space law and policy happens to be. That being said, I'm going to focus right now on where the United States comes into play on that. And before I get to that, many of you may know, but I'm just going to try to summarize as quickly as I can, because I've taught an entire semester on the U.S. space regulatory regime. But just to talk about essentially our perspective in the United States, not only on space law, but our legal system generally. And, a good parallel is the way that privacy law is treated in the European Union versus the United States. The European Union, you have your basic data directive, the GDPR, that is encompassing with respect to all types of private information. Here in the United States, it's segmented. We have the Child Online Privacy Protection Act. We have HIPAA for health information. We have Gramm-Leach-Bliley and the Financial Modernization Act for financial information, and the list goes on. Similarly, we've got kind of that system, that segmented system with respect to regulating space. And one might argue that it grew organically because, let's say, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, regulated aviation or airplanes before we came to the space era in the 1950s, 60s, and beyond. That arguably is the case. Similarly with satellites after Sputnik and so forth, and you had the FCC regulating satellite communications. And then NOAA, which, apologies for the absence of the second A there, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. So these three agencies, though, are the core, the primary agencies that regulate space endeavors in the United States from a commercial perspective. The FAA is regulating, not surprisingly, the launch and the re-entry of satellite space objects, what have you, and payloads, whatever the case may be. Obviously, the launch of the rockets and the space vehicles, and then the re-entry of anything in that sort. What's interesting about the FAA and then transitioning, let's talk about satellites just for a moment, transitioning to the FCC jurisdiction, is there's an argument that a gap exists from the point of launch when you get past the launch and let's say that you're a satellite and you're getting to orbit rise, for example, the Starlink, SpaceX Starlink satellites, as they are orbiting around Earth and rising to the level of their then stationary, well, they won't be stationary, but the orbit, the height or altitude of their orbit, who regulates that kind of orbit rise phase where it's not yet operational and falls into the FCC jurisdiction, but it's actually post-launch? So that is an argument for some mechanism, some structure in the United States to come in and make sure that we're covering all aspects. And I'll get to that later at the end. Clearly, for satellites, communications, the FCC regulates both the space stations and the ground stations. Now, it's not just the communications anymore that the FCC regulates in that regard. And there's some pushback in the fact that the FCC Federal Communications Commission has implemented regulations governing or mitigating, rather, space debris. My comment on that, and those to say that the FCC shouldn't have gone down that path, is we've been talking about space debris, which orbital debris in the United States, for some reason we need to have a different word, but orbital debris, space debris, the same concept. We've been talking about it since at least 1993. There are actually documents from the Reagan administration in the late 80s kind of starting to mention it, but the real discussion began in the Clinton administration in 1993, I believe. So for 30 years, we've been talking about it, and only in the last few years has an agency, commission, department, any part of the United States government actually really focused and came up with some substantive and robust regulations. Now, on top of all of that, if we have a satellite that is going to do Earth observation, then we would need a license through NOAA, NOAA. And NOAA regulates Earth observation of U.S.-based satellites, or observation ideally of the U.S., but U.S.-based satellites or companies need to have a NOAA license for Earth observation. And that's whether your imagery is pixel, think about the 8-bit, 16-bit graphics that I had growing up, or to the high-resolution 8K images that we're so much talking about today. So these are the primary agencies that regulate commercial space operations in the United States. Now, following those broader regulations, each of those agencies have, over the last few years, tried to create and implement streamlined regulations for smaller satellites, particularly with respect to the fees, which can be, 6 figures. Small satellites need, arguably, I agree, I represent many small satellite companies, less burdensome regulations, less costly fees. And so there are the streamlined small sat regulations. So even within those 3 primary agencies, we've got at least 2 sets of regulations depending on whether you're small sat or falling above that. Beyond those, then, of course, if we're talking technology that might be subject to the United States munitions list, which relates to ITAR. ITAR and the United States munitions list fall under the Department of State. The Department of Commerce, the DOC here, has EAR, the Export Administrative Regulations, that same concept, regulating technology that can be exported, but less stringent than your ITAR. ITAR is on the top. Now, United States munitions list, one might think, not incorrectly necessarily, or I guess not surprisingly, one might think munitions list, we're talking primarily military. You would be surprised at the breadth of the United States munitions list. And so even satellite technology could fall within the scope of the United States munitions list and regulation by ITAR. I can just say very clearly and quickly that violating ITAR has significant penalties that nobody wants to have to deal with. So for developing a payload, a satellite, any kind of technology related to space or other aspects of technology that might fit within that, we've got to make sure, does it fall within the United States munitions list, or with respect to EAR, the Commerce Control List, does it fall within those? What do we need to do? What licenses do we need? Are there exemptions? And that's on top of everything that we talked about before. Now, depending on what one might be working with in the payload or the particular mission, you might end up interacting with NASA. You might use some of the NASA patents and intellectual property that's available. Then, of course, we've got Congress and oversight of different space operations and efforts to kind of monitor the U.S. regulatory regime. And at any one time, there are a number of pieces of legislation on particular space topics. And in fact, there has been some talk through some aspects of Congress and people about how do we shift the U.S. regulatory regime. We've got this segmented approach. There's been some talk about consolidating all of it within just the Department of Commerce, which at first blush, just the consolidation is not necessarily a bad idea in concept. I'm not sure the Department of Commerce is the place to put it, because then it does shift with the tides of the presidential 4-year term, the Department of Commerce being under the jurisdiction and control of the then White House or president. Consolidation, though, is not necessarily bad, but there's also been talk more of a particular isolationist view, and that we should pull back and the United States should minimally comply with its international obligations, and we should think about our strategy first and put us above everything else. And there's the misnomer, and it drives me crazy when I hear about this or people argue it, the misnomer that, my God, if the United States has regulations governing space companies, they're going to find another country out there that has less regulation and go there, and we're going to lose out. There are a couple problems with that. One, they've said that about many technologies, and while it might have some countries move and here and there, and sometimes you can even look at the film industry, sometimes they film in Canada versus the United States. Some places, some companies do go to favorable locations. But one of the problems with this with respect to space under the current regulatory regime is even if you launched from a different country, if you are a United States-based company, or you're wanting to service parties in the United States, you are going to be subject to United States regulation, whether you want to or not. So even if you launch from, pick your favorite country other than the United States, if you're providing communications to a ground station in the United States, or receiving communications from somewhere in the United States, you are going to be subject to regulation by the FCC. There's no way to avoid that. Even if you said, I'm not just going to launch, I'm going to move my entire base of operations and incorporate in the most friendly country out there. And another history of my firm and another regulatory and legal environment, Vanuatu was one company that we found had incorporated itself in that country for favorable regulations, and they did have ties to the United States and so forth. But let's just pick Vanuatu. But if you are still providing communications to United States citizens, or using ground stations in the United States, or providing services to United States, you are going to be subject to the FCC. If you're going to be taking images of the United States, theoretically, or you have any connection to the United States, NOAA might still be involved. If you're United States citizens and you're sharing technology, you might still be subject to ITAR and EAR. So you're not going to get away with it. And there's not just because the United States implements some space debris regulations, the world is not going to collapse in the United States around commercial space operations. It's just not going to happen. And so it's scare tactics. It's not going to happen. That being said, it's an isolationist kind of view to pull back, and we should do the minimal necessary to comply with our international obligations. We should have no regulations, no constraints, and so forth. We just focus on ourselves here. I don't like that view. I think that it's problematic. I think it's erroneous. I don't think it serves anybody any good, and it does not put the United States in a leadership or influential position. And so I advocate more for taking an influential approach, an influential and visionary approach. And we can kind of see that as the United States adopted and pushed and implemented the Artemis Accords. Now, as Ugo mentioned before, one of the things that he was talking about was space resources. And he mentioned that, you know, you have on one hand the Moon Agreement, which says that even the regolith that you might mine from the moon is province of all humankind. Nobody can claim ownership to it. Asteroids, rocks, whatever, it's all for science. And that's in the Moon Agreement. The United States is not a signatory to the Moon Agreement. And not only is the United States not a signatory, the United States has actually adopted a law that is conflicting with that particular part of the Moon Agreement. Not the whole Moon Agreement isn't bad, but we're not a signatory regardless. But the United States has adopted a law that, yeah, we can own space resources. If we invest the money and the time and everything and go and land someplace and mine, whatever the case may be, we can have private ownership of it. And as Ugo mentioned, Luxembourg has followed the UAE, I believe, I think also Japan. In any case, there are a few countries that have even gone beyond kind of a position of not adopting the Moon Agreement, but not rejecting it, to now having laws conflicting with that. Putting that aside, the Artemis Accords do really kind of track and try to modernize the principles under the other four space treaties: peaceful purposes, transparency, interoperability. You can read these here. And I talked about space resources, deconfliction, you know, trying to get to long-term sustainability guidelines and adopting those, avoiding harmful interference, orbital debris we've talked about. And so the Artemis Accords are kind of a shift where I don't really see us being able to get to the point of having a new space treaty. It would be great, but I don't see that happening. And the Artemis Accords are kind of the next best thing. But that's on a policy level, an international policy level. And I do believe that the United States should be a leader, not the only leader, but a leader in that, rather than taking the isolationist approach. And that's never going to get us anywhere. Another scare tactic that many people advocating the isolation approach is that, you know, if we have regulations restricting any kind of use of space technology, you know, we're going to let the rogue nations take control and we're going to get behind. That hasn't happened in other areas, really. I mean, you could argue whether technology in one country is more advanced than the United States, or whether the United States or the EU falls way behind some other adversaries in the world, but it's not been this dramatic revolutionary demise. And I don't foresee that happening. Now, we've talked about then maintaining that kind of leadership position. And last year I talked about, you know, we really can't wait for a treaty. We can't rely solely on guidelines, recommendations, or thoughts. We do need something more. Self-governance by industry is not going to work in space or any other industry. It just, industry itself has demonstrated that as a fact. And just a quick aside is, again, in the United States, privacy issues. For a long time, the companies, everybody was saying, don't regulate us. We've got this covered on the internet. We'll protect privacy. Well, then we learned that they don't necessarily protect privacy and do what they want with information that they acquire. Congress suddenly woke up and said, whoa, wait a second. How did that happen? Well, part of it's we trusted industry and antiquated regulation. So where do we go? I'm going to close out here by getting to the point that I was driving at. We do need a United States new space regime. What does that look like? I see it in two phases. you already have the FCC kind of extracting its space operations into a separate division. That might happen in the FAA, that might happen in NOAA, and so forth. So let's assume that each of these agencies, those three primaries in particular, were to kind of compartmentalize. There's still probably some interrelationships and so forth, but compartmentalize within each of those agencies those aspects devoted specifically to space. And so if we get to that point and everything is running smooth, then we can get to a point where they are able to be consolidated into another umbrella kind of commission, where those segmented divisions within the FAA, FCC, NOAA are moved to this new space agency, if you want to have it that way. But it cannot be in the Department of Commerce. I do not think one of the advantages of the Federal Communications Commission is that it's an independent commission. Yes, the commissioners, there are 5, are appointed by presidents, but the terms of the commissioners, extend beyond any particular one administration. So there is an overlap. And we need that because if we're going to maintain a leadership position in the US, we can't be in a position to where it's governed solely by the whims of an administration coming in or not. We can't have regulation of space debris depend on whether somebody's pro-regulation, I think we all recognize that there's a need to regulate space debris or mitigate space debris and get rid of it, or we won't be able to use space. And that's not a fallacy. That's not a hypothetical. We already have to maneuver around all of the debris out there. So 2 phases. The agencies that exist now continue to compartmentalize or segment the space operations within their own jurisdiction. So that'll take a while. We make sure that runs smooth. We create, if we must, a separate independent commission similar to the FCC. Unlike the FCC, the FAA is part of the Department of Transportation under the White House. Similarly, NOAA is part of the Department of Commerce under the White House. The FCC is independent. This new Space Commission should be independent, separate from the administration whims. And then we can consolidate all that. We're not going to be able to do all of it. Clearly, when we talk about ITAR and EAR and dealing with the Department of State, Department of Commerce on that, there are going to be aspects that will be continued in other agencies. But this Space Commission could help commercial operators coordinate and navigate that particular system. And so that's where I'm all for consolidation. I'm all for making it much easier, but it can't be within a particular administration, the White House. It needs to be an independent commission. Terms longer than presidential for the commissioners and staggered so that it has that breadth and longevity. And then we can be a leading authority, among others, in advocating for strong future space policy. One final point that I'd make on this is we need to ensure that space remains a province for all humankind and all human endeavors. There's a lot of talk and there's a lot of defeatist position out there that industry will never give up anything. Industry is not going to let the stargazers have unfettered access to the night sky anymore. It's just a losing battle. We should wave the white flag and forevermore forget what it's like to look at the Milky Way. I'm being exaggerating a bit, but I don't buy into the defeatist argument. And I think that we all can work together. And I think it would be harmful. It would be tragic for us to concede that the stargazers, the astronomers, the astrophysicists, the Boy Scouts that go out into the dark fields and look at the night sky looking for the astronomy merit badge, cannot have unfettered access to the sky. Space is big. We can share it. We just need to all work together toward a future of space sustainability. And with that, I'm going to conclude, and I'm happy to open it up to questions for both Ugo and myself. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your interesting presentations. If it's okay with you too, I'll read a question from the WOBA platform to start the conversation. And for all of those in the public, feel free to ask any questions for our speakers to answer. Okay, the question is there any particular organization which could fill the role of functional regulator in space? Might an organization like Interpol be able to breach objectives of regulation and law enforcement in space instead of national paramilitary or military organizations, for example, space forces?
I'll take a quick crack at it, and then I'm interested to hear Ugo's side of things. I think that I hear where the question is coming from, and I do believe that the regulation of space should not be militarized. And there's a long debate in the United States on that. And that's why NASA is not part of the United States military. Now, clearly, there's been a lot of talk in the United States, and there is a development of the Space Force, United States Space Force. In actuality, that was part of the Air Force for some time. It was just broken out and looking at space defense. And I can't begrudge any country from thinking about and looking to defense from space. We're always looking at what might come. But in answer to the question, I think absolutely that the regulation of space should not be governed by the military, whether it can be international or not. We can, to some extent, with the treaties, to the extent that countries sign on to treaties. And I think, even Ugo mentioned earlier, I mean, the Moon Agreement, to which the United States isn't even a party, was from the early 1980s. That's the last, that's really the last international space treaty for decades. So, but every country has its sovereign ability to regulate the persons within its country. And so I don't think that we'll ever get to a point where an international body is the sole regulator of space operations. That being said, even the United States, any country that does sign the treaties, and we are a signatory to the other four, are bound by those treaties. And just to reiterate a point I made before, no country should be looking at international obligations and treaties and saying, how can we minimally comply with this? That kind of is defeating the whole purpose of coming together and reaching an agreement on that. Ugo, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that we pay attention to the fact that we are talking about space law, and space law was the daughter of the Cold War. So that contrary to civil aviation, which started with an organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, we don't have nothing like that. Alas, we don't have nothing like that in concerning space activities. As regards the militarization of space, of course, we have international humanitarian law. And here the law of physics plays a major role, even more than legal regulations. Charles, you know pretty well the Kessler syndrome, and for the non-expert, so to speak, the Kessler syndrome is a scientific work demonstrating the impact of creating debris in space. Well, Charles published very interesting works on dark and quiet skies, and it depends only on commercial reasons. You may imagine the disaster of actually what happened with ASAT, namely anti-satellite weapons, and what happened after China, India, and Russia experiments out there. It was a catastrophe. And in particular, the worst was the Chinese experiment, and that space debris is going to be over there for centuries. So, humankind has this favorite pastime to destroy our environment and potentially ourselves. And the most direct way to achieve that stupid goal would be a Star War. Because, again, we have to pay attention to the environment in which we are thinking about the militarization of space, the use of anti-satellite weapons, and the like. And in my view, especially after the last Russian experiment, the reaction of the international community against what the Russian Federation did was so strong that we may say that a sort of customary international law is emerging concerning the fact that there is no good reason why you may use a kinetic force on space, because the impact on the environment and the impact on, the Earth would be so catastrophic that there is no reasonable reason to use weapons on space. And of course, it's still an open issue whether this is going to be anytime soon customary law. Therefore binding all countries, regardless of whether they are signing international agreements. But again, what I've seen some years ago, namely the reaction of the international community, and even the excuse of the Russian Federation, that from a scientific viewpoint was completely nonsensical, but the very fact that they needed to excuse themselves, that stressed the fact that hopefully some kind of acknowledgement of how any kind of weapon in outer space would be self-defeating should be pretty clear. Maybe too optimistic, but I think that the last catastrophe out there with the Russian experiment strengthens this view.
I agree.
Christopher Guillen sent a clarification for his previous question. He says, the question pertains to the role of use of force in a space sector up to and including action against non-state actors operating in space, like, for example, piracy, illicit land and celestial object claims, or illicit broadcasting.
I'll respond really quickly. I think that there is one of the 5 space treaties is the Liability Convention, and the Liability Convention kind of builds upon some aspects of the Outer Space Treaty, but the Liability Convention kind of sets up a paradigm in which countries are responsible for what happens to other country-owned objects in space, or where things might be owned by their citizens that are harmed in space, and kind of sets up that regime to handle that particular dispute. So that if and clearly if one country were to intentionally shoot a missile Like Ugo mentioned the ASAT test, that was countries doing that to their own kind of space stations out there as opposed to somebody else's. But if a country directly attacked another country in space, that's clearly, I would argue, an act of war, beyond just falling within the liability convention. But the liability convention is where I would direct people to read to kind of set up that structure for handling disputes. And I think it's well structured, and that doesn't preclude using the private legal systems within the different countries as well. So that if I have a company that's harmed by another satellite because it went errant or so forth and collided, knocked mine out, not only could I go through perhaps the mechanism of the liability convention, but I also have recourse in private courts of law. And that might be in my country initially, that might be in the country of whom the company that hit me. But I think that if there was any overt act by one country against another country, that falls even way more into acts of war and international law in that regard than just accidental collisions.
And if I may add, I think that rather than kinetic attacks or in outer space, what's more relevant here concerns cyber wars and cyber security.
Right.
Again, Russia is a good example. Sorry, but what happened with day one of the Russian aggression to Ukraine when there was a cyber attack. And all the story that Viasat was knocked down, and then in a week, Elon Musk intervened. Here again, we have a big issue, how a single private man can take decisions so crucial concerning matters of peace and war. But that's another webinar. But
it would be an interesting one because, Ugo, I completely agree that that raises so many issues, how one private company, one individual that the company is a US-based company that can jump in to international policy and diplomacy and kind of play that. I do think it's another webinar, but it's an interesting one that it would be. Yeah.
And so back to the question, I think it's more realistic and even trickier to imagine potential issues of militarization and the like, and not in the traditional terms of these formulas, but in the cyber domain.
Yeah.
For the simple reason that cyberspace has included and englobed outer space.
Yes.
So we have a fully integrated digital ecosystem within which we have all space activities and missions. And so from a strategic viewpoint, I'm not reinventing the wheel. All big players here do know it pretty well. The big issue here is not traditional warfare, but cyber
war. And picking up on what you were talking about in your presentation, the development of AI accentuates that even more. I think that
Absolutely.
The ability to deploy AI and in that combination of cybersecurity, cyber warfare is significantly problematic and leading again to the need for some norms governing that. But I completely agree with you, Ugo.
Okay, if there are no other questions or comments, is it okay with...
And so my question to Charles, because I enjoyed his presentation, and I do understand that the bad old position about isolation is still popular in the US. Although, how to put it, there are so many reasons, depending not only on self-interest, but only on the law of physics, that make this position untenable. And that's why I enjoy your critique to any US isolation, starting with satellites. You properly stressed how satellites are relevant. So far, it's market mostly dominated by US-based companies. SpaceX has the most important orbits out there. But still, you have to take into account the international regulatory framework of the ITU. And sooner or later, because scale matters not only for engineering reasons, but only for legal reasons. Good rules of international law within which US-based companies operate were set up in a world with few and huge big satellites. Now we are launching hundreds of thousands of, in perspective, of course, of satellites every year. And so it's, to me, the strongest critique of any isolation temptation, so to speak, is to stress that it's your self-interest to redesign this international framework, because starting with, how to put it, which is closer to us here down on Earth, namely satellites, and the fact that the internet communications, an increasing number of Earth activities depend on satellite data. Well, it's pretty obvious that although ITU is trying to organize and reorganize itself, it's the self-interest of all countries, starting with the US, to redesign this international framework. What do you think about that, Charles?
I completely agree, and I think that's a good point. And it's kind of like an old adage that if you want to make sure that the rules are fair, you need to be in the rulemaking process. You can't sit out. And I think that an isolationist view has a kind of distorted view on real politics. Some of the perspective on that isolationist view has the understanding or misunderstanding that we've got to be thinking about ourselves because there could be some rogue country out there that's going to be doing the same thing, thinking about themselves, and we don't want to get into a position where we have jeopardized our space program and so forth. But on the other hand, there will always probably be a rogue nation out there, like you were mentioning. I mean, Russia doing things and so forth. There's always going to be that possibility. But if the United States or any other country takes an isolationist perspective and sits back, the rest of the world is going to be talking, and the rest of the world is going to be developing a new framework and a policy and so forth. And if any country wants to have their say in what those rules or what that new framework happens to be, and it goes to, like you said, self-interest, if I want to shape what that new policy is going to be, I need to participate. I can't sit back in a closet and let the rest of the world go by. So it is in the self-interest of the United States or any country to participate in kind of dealing and developing that new regime for space so that everybody's protected. And we will always possibly have that rogue country, but that can't tie our hands and that shouldn't be used to constrain the participation in what really is needed. Because as you also mentioned, that not only just with the debris, the Kessler syndrome, but we really are at a point where we need to think about the future of space and the sustainability of space and its use for everybody, all kinds of endeavors, and everybody should come to the table, particularly if they're wanting to have their voice, because the rest of the world could decide if if you're not there, the rest of the world could decide without you, if that makes sense. But I do agree with you completely, Hugo.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting, and the presentations and this conversation. And we hope you enjoy it, and the audience, and we hope to see you in future conferences.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers.